Nearly 120 years ago, a pivotal novel was released that told the story of a woman struggling with the social conventions of being a wife and mother while finally understanding the full power of her own sexuality and herself. This astounding novel is called The Awakening. The Awakening created a fictional heroine for women that displayed the issue of an internal struggle between her own happiness and what society expected of her.
A brief character list from the book The Awakening is Edna Pontellier, who is the main protagonist, Lance Pontellier, who is Edna's husband, Robert Lebrun, who falls in love with Edna, Elsie Arobin, who pursues an affair with Edna, Mademoiselle Rees, who is an independent woman, Madame Adele, who is the epitome of a mother woman, the Colonel, who is Edna's father, amongst other supporting characters who we haven't mentioned.
During the summer, Edna Pontellier meets a young man named Robert Lebrun who often flirts with women. The two spend almost all their time together, and Edna starts to experience a change within herself. She and Robert spend a lot of time in and near the ocean, but one day, Robert suddenly departs to go to Veracruz for business prospects. Edna is upset and becomes depressed when Robert leaves. That summer, Edna also befriends Mademoiselle Rise, a woman who can make Edna cry by playing the piano. Edna starts painting and starts behaving in what her husband considers an uncharacteristic manner. Edna discovers that Robert has been writing letters to Rise about her, and she visits her to read the letters and listen to her friend play the piano. Edna's father, the Colonel, comes to visit the Pontelliers. Edna devotes all her energies towards him when he's there. After the Colonel leaves, Leonce and the children also leave. Edna enjoys her newfound freedom. She goes to the racetracks to bet on horses and begins spending a lot of time with Elise Arobin, who has the reputation of being a player. While visiting Rise one day, Edna decides that she's going to move out of her house. She wants to be independent and doesn't want her husband to have any sort of claim on her. That same day, she hears that Robert is returning to New Orleans, and she admits for the first time that she is in love with him. Edna sleeps with Arobin for the first time and feels many emotions, but no shame, and doesn't form any real attachment to him. She runs into Robert at Rise's apartment, and then a few days later, he returns home with her. They profess their love to each other, and Robert expresses his desire to marry her. However, Edna has to leave to be there for Adele while she is in labor. Adele warns Edna that she must consider her children in whatever she does. Edna is depressed at her friend's words, but excited to rejoin Robert. Sadly, however, she finds Robert gone forever. Having already decided on her course of action, she walks down to the beach and stands naked in the sun. Without really thinking, she begins to swim out in the ocean. She thinks triumphantly about how she has escaped her children, and she continues to swim until she's exhausted. Memories of her childhood flash before her eyes as she slowly drowns. You can be whoever you want to be, as long as society says so. In this time, Edna Pontellier was not so much individual compared to someone today, but back then it was considered extreme for a woman to act out of society's standard by the slightest. Imagine if you had actually just a little bit of personality back then. As a woman, you would be shunned for being different than what you were expected to be.
Edna faces many restrictions and expectations only because she's a female. She wants to be independent, but being independent is seen as unfeminine. She finds that acting like a male fulfills her needs. She isn't judged for her sexual urges. She can be independent, and she enjoys gambling at the racetracks. Edna faces the issue of sexism around the time of the women's suffrage movement. And while Edna herself is not actively involved in the women's suffrage movement, her struggle is still based in the same foundation that women are not treated as equal to men. Edna has two examples in her life of two different things that she wants. Adele, who has the sexuality that Edna desires, but she submits to her husband and her children. And Rees, who is completely independent but has no sexuality. Rees is stripped of her femininity because she is independent and isn't seen as someone who's feminine.
Marriage, love, and family come in all shapes and sizes in today's society. It was not always this way, though. The views on it in 1899, when The Awakening was written, were very one-sided. Today there are choices. You can choose not to marry, you can marry the same sex, or you can even choose not to have children at all. The strict views on marriage, love, and family for this novel derive itself from the setting, Louisiana. The Creole or natives of the state were very flirtatious, but they never crossed the line of committing adultery, because most were Catholic and they were governed by the Napoleonic law. Under the Napoleonic law, marriage, love, and family were very constricted compared to today. Marriage. Women were supposed to be virgins, entering into a marriage with their husbands during the late 19th century. Faithfulness was expected, and divorce was so rare it was shocking and appalling when it occurred. Love. You get that one person. But love was really not a factor during this time period. Most people were pressured by social norms to be married and have children once they hit a certain age. And finally, family. Men were the breadwinners while wives took care of the house and children. Children were expected to be seen but not heard, and this was the wife's duty to make sure they did so. Overall, women were expected to remain devoted to their husbands and children and be a family until death, no matter what circumstances.
Society is made up of class, reputation, and existence. In society there are stereotypes, such as females should be loyal to their husbands and wives should be mothers. That is more over towards the book side. With class, normally you think of your poor, middle, and high class, or poor, middle, and rich class, but in The Awakening, they have a class of people known as the Creole, which are Louisiana French, and they're very open and close people. It's very important because reputation is how people view you. In the book, Edna moved to the pigeon house to keep his reputation. Leonce had their actual house renovated to make it seem like he wasn't neglecting his wife, and that's why she moved. And then existence. In the beginning of the book, Edna just felt like she was just there. She didn't actually feel like she had an existence, but then towards the end she kind of realized what her existence was. And in today's society, existence shouldn't just be just living there, it should be more than that.
At the opening of the novel, there are two birds, a parrot and a mockingbird. The parrot shrieks and swears at Mr. Pontellier. This gives voice to Edna's unspoken feelings. It is also in a cage, which is a form of literal imprisonment that highlights Edna's figurative imprisonment. The mockingbird, who is also caged, represents Mademoiselle Reisz, with its odd markings and the whistling notes it produces. We learn at the start of the novel that the mockingbird is the only one who is capable of understanding the parrot's Spanish. By the end of the novel, Mademoiselle Reisz is the only one capable of understanding Edna. Caged birds in general are representative of women during the Victorian era, living out their lives in gilded cages, present for decoration, given every comfort, and banned from any real freedom.
Let's get a little history on the setting of The Awakening to fully understand the characters, author, and the culture. As we know, Louisiana is a huge portion of the book's setting. This state has the greatest French influence today. When the book was written, the state was largely Catholic and governed by Napoleonic law. Napoleon was a strong military leader that conquered much of Europe in the 19th century. He created this law in 1804, giving the post-revolutionary France the first set of laws dealing with property, colonial affairs, family, and individual rights. These laws gave Kate Chopin's characters their qualities because they had grown up around these rules. This led the main character questioning herself and struggling with the fact that she did not fit into these regulations. Even though Louisiana had the greatest French influence, the first explorers were Spanish, one of them being De Soto. He came looking for gold in 1541, but once he passed, Spanish seemed to lose interest in the land, giving the French room to come in. In 1682, La Salle came down the Mississippi for the Great Lakes, claiming Mississippi River Valley for France. This is the start of a long game of tug-of-war between the two countries. France secretly turned over control to the Spanish. The French settlers did not find this out until 2 years later. They were very upset, and rightfully so, leading them to rebel and drive out the Spanish. But just 5 years later, Spain gained control again. France tugged at the rope once more again and gained control in 1800, and was later sold to the United States as part of the famous Louisiana Purchase, where more problems arose. During the Louisiana Purchase, Spain still somehow retained some of the land, but in 1810 U.S. troops entered, taking control. Louisiana was still not over. During the War of 1812, the British tried to take control of New Orleans, at the time one of the greatest seaports, and seaports equal money, so of course there's going to be a fight over this land. During the battle, Andrew Jackson defeated the British, but unknown to either side, the war had ended 2 weeks prior. All of this is important to us today because without these events, where would we be? What cultural changes would there be in Louisiana, or even the world? Without these events, we wouldn't have the outcomes we have today. The old saying goes, everything happens for a reason, right?
The impact of the author's life on the novel was a very strong one. Kate Chopin grew up with her female relatives pretty much being widowed. Her mother was a widow, her grandmother was a widow, and her great-grandmother was a widow. She grew up around those smart, independent women that taught her to be independent. And this also brought the independency into her book, The Awakening. The main character, Edna, wants to be independent. And Mademoiselle Reyes, who already is independent and has her own creative spirit. Another factor is her great-great-grandmother had been the first woman in St. Louis to obtain a legal separation from her husband, after which she raised her 5 children. This just shows another factor of how she had an independent woman affect her life.
So the big question, why should people read the book The Awakening? It gives insight to those who don't know much about the struggles of women who question their place in society and whether or not they should break away from what is expected of them. It also explores some historical aspects that we can learn about, like the women's suffrage movement, and if you look deeper, things like Napoleonic law. And last but not least, it is an overall very well written novel, and we highly suggest it to anyone who is wondering if they should give it a chance.